Thanks for having me out. New member of the department. It's exciting to get a chance to talk to folks, get to know some folks, and have some people look at some of my work. This is a part of an ongoing project that John Slapin and I have been working on since I was a second-year faculty member at the University of Houston. And it originates in a hallway fight that John and I had. I've been thinking about party loyalty for a long time, and why legislators might sometimes defect from their parties on roll call votes. And American legislative politics takes a particular view of this, that moderates should be the most disloyal people in their party because they can get bought off by the other party relatively cheaply. When you talk to comparative legislative scholars about this topic, this seems just entirely nonsensical to them, that it is ideological extremists who are disloyal to their party, that they're the ones trying to craft a mavericky kind of ideology or perception among the public, and that moderates are super loyal because they're trying to climb the party ladder to achieve cabinet positions and things like that. And so we had this long discussion about which of these positions actually makes sense in a sort of big picture legislative world. And the answer is both of them do and neither of them do. The story is both more complicated, but complicated via just simple addition. Both of these things are going on at the same time, somewhat surprisingly. Today we're going to take a little bit of a different tact on it. John and I developed some theoretical work about how all this process works. But today we're going to do something that's different for me in a lot of ways, and I think maybe a little different for the way that we think about social science. We're about to do the most inductive thing I've ever done. Like, we're going to jump into this thing with no idea what's going on, and we're going to hope the data tells us something meaningful at the end, and then I'm going to leave it to all of the young people in the room to test the story that we come up with, because I don't want to do it. Right? So let's prepare for some jargon. We're going to talk about text analysis today, and we're going to talk about cluster analysis today, and we're going to talk about random forests today, and out-of-sample prediction, and correlation is causation. No, we're not going to do that one. Important note, none of those words have anything to do with actual British politics. It's all math all the time. So here we go. So we want to talk about rebellion in the UK House of Commons. This is the thing that we're working on. I tend to think of myself as a legislative scholar rather than a Congress scholar or a state legislature scholar or something like that. I'm interested in general legislative politics and general representation. And so we want to lay out a couple of on-the-ground facts, right? Some stylized facts about the way that legislative politics works in Britain. This is going to seem, I'm going to explain how this could possibly be true, right? Rebellion is both simultaneously rare and a little more common than you think it is, right? So only about 5% of votes that get cast in the House of Commons oppose the majority of their own party, right? So this is really rare in the sort of big picture for somebody to oppose their party. But between 10 and 40%, depending on which session of Parliament we're talking about, do divisions is what we call a vote in UK politics, do divisions experience one rebellion, right? So it's pretty common for parties to have somebody rebel. It's just not very common for an individual to be that person rebelling, right? So we get some rebellion, and we can observe a fair bit of it. And about 80 to 90% of MPs rebel at some point within a parliamentary term, right? So most people will rebel at some point. A healthy number of divisions receive a rebellion, but the vast majority of votes are themselves not rebellions, right? We know some things about rebellion. We think we know, at least. John and I have been, this is not forthcoming anymore, it's 2018. Ideological extremists tend to rebel very frequently when they're in government, right? But they are hyper loyal when they're in opposition. They're the most loyal members of the opposition party and the least loyal members of the governing party, which is what John and I's work tries to understand and explain why these people would dynamically change as a function of governing status. We suspect that they do so in order to grandstand, that they're not really worried about policy outcomes when they vote against their party, that they're not trying to win. They're just trying to make a public point about the fact that the party's not doing enough of whatever it is the party is engaged in at the time, that it's much more of a position-taking activity than it is some sort of effort to change policy proposals in a meaningful way. So they espouse positions that certain constituents may want to hear, particularly ideologically extreme constituents may want to hear, even if those policies are going to be unaffected by that rebellion itself, right? Most rebellious members, the prior work on this topic had sort of concluded that the most rebellious members of Parliament were just weird. There wasn't a whole lot of strategic thinking underlying their rebellions. It was just some people, sort of like a character trait, that were more rebellious than other people were. And they just sort of ingrained in them. John and I want to say, nah, it's a little more nuanced than that is, right? So what we want to know, what we're trying to figure out is, if this grandstanding perspective is right, if you're doing it, if you're rebelling as a sort of mode of position taking, that ought to mean something for the way that you talk about rebellion, right? It should mean that you're using that rebellion to connect to constituents rather than to make a point to other MPs, right? And so the way that you connect to those people almost certainly looks different. How does it look different? I have no idea at the beginning of this paper, right? But I'm pretty certain that it should look different, right? So I'm going to start out with Peter Bowen, who is the MP from Wellingborough, right? And Peter Bowen is extremely rebellious. He was a conservative MP who rebelled against the Queen's speech, which is a statement of the governing party's agenda, right? So the Conservative Party's in charge. They make a speech about what their agenda is going to be. It's a big, important moment in British politics. And then Bowen and a few of his colleagues say, actually, we think our own party's agenda is dumb, and we're going to come up with a new agenda that is entirely independent of what you folks are talking about. So this is just the purest form of rebellion against your party that you can have. You guys just won an election, and now you're going to say, we worked really hard to win that election, and everybody else in this party is terrible, right? So but if we just look at Wikipedia and we try and figure out a little bit about what Peter looks like, he voted against abolishing the offenses of blasphemy and blasphemous libel. So he wants libelous speech to stick around and be suable and all that sort of stuff. He voted to lower the abortion time limit to 12 weeks, his notably conservative position. He opposed the introduction of a national minimum wage, his classic conservative politics. He backed private members' bills proposing to enable employees to opt out of the minimum wage. So he's against labor and employee power and all that sort of stuff. Bowen was one of 3 MPs to specifically boost their ratings on the internet as an effort by saying very little, and when they say stuff, saying really vitriolic kinds of things, right? So he's thinking about connecting with constituents and his public image via what he talks about. And he camped outside of Parliament in an effort to facilitate parliamentary debate on this alternative Queen's speech, the backup agenda that was hyper-ideologically extreme within the Conservative Party, right? And so what we would conclude from Bowen is that he's really pretty conservative, right? So it's hard to gauge what ideology looks like in British politics from roll call votes, but if we look at all the sort of circumstantial evidence, we would conclude that this fellow is pretty ideologically conservative, even within his own party, all right? So here's some things that he's saying about wind farms in Britain, right? So he voted against this bill, despite the fact that the rest of the party was on board with this particular bill. And he's talking about case studies suggesting that wind turbines have impacts on property values, things that constituents care a lot. I assume that it was some European Union directive, but it's not. It's the sort of thing that would come out of Europe if it had the opportunity to. I know that the Department of Energy and Climate Change is looking into the issue, but I'm planning to abolish those departments in the relatively near future. This doesn't sound like the sort of speech that somebody is making to their fellow MPs, right? Like, hey guys, by the way, I'm going to ruin government in just a little bit, in case you were wondering. This sounds like a thing that somebody might say to their constituents who were themselves ideologically extreme as a kind of a way to make a point about how ideologically extreme you are, right? If we look at some other people who talked about this same issue, we start seeing some different things, like our policy is intended to achieve a goal. We're going to talk about honorable members referring to trilemmas in energy policy. The way that we talk about the issue is going to get a little more nuanced and a little more complicated very suddenly. Turns out Matthew Hannock voted for this particular piece of legislation. So it looks like, I still don't know what the differences are, but it feels like in a kind of intuitive way that the way these folks are talking about their votes is a little bit different. All right? So what we want to know, what we're trying to figure out is, does Peter Bowen differ systematically in his style of speaking from other MPs? He's a rebellious fellow. He's a rebellious fellow out on the ideological extremes of his own party. Does the way that he talks, which sort of feels anecdotally true, systematically differ from the other MPs? Could we, if we didn't have his name and label on the speech, identify Peter Bowen just from the words? Without the votes, without the labels, without any of that stuff, would I be able to say, that's the talk of somebody who's about to rebel, that's the talk of somebody who's not about to rebel? Go.
Are you looking looking to see whether he always talks differently or whether he talks differently specifically?
We're trying to figure out the specific rebellion thing. Can I identify what's about to be a rebellion on a division from a speech? Not can I identify Peter Bowen as an odd fellow, right? I could do that just via his Wikipedia page. What I want to know is when he gives a speech, is the speech that precedes a rebellion different than the speech that doesn't precede a rebellion? Can I predict the rebellion that's about to happen based on the way that people use that language? Which would indicate to us that the rebel vote is itself an effort to grandstand, to position take, as opposed to alter policy in a meaningful way. Yeah, I have really good peripheral vision.
Justin, do rebels have systematically different constituencies?
Yes. So this is one of the things that we figured out in the earlier papers is that constituents for rebels look quite different, particularly on the issues that are about to be rebelled on, right? So there's a strong constituent connection between this rebelliousness and as a multidimensional thing, right? Like you rebel on the particular area that's about to harm your constituents in some meaningful way.
My question with the constituency is a little different. Do they differ in terms of socioeconomic and, more important, educational characteristics?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. There's some work coming out from behavioral scholars in Britain showing that you can build a personal vote via rebellion. If memory serves, the interactions of those effects with education are positively related, that more educated voters will reward rebellion more than less educated voters do, which I was surprised by, but that I can't promise that that's right. That's what ticks in my memory. Nick Vivian's been doing some of this stuff with some conjoint experiment style things.
Just quickly, because if there is an association between level of education and rebellion, it might be that rebellious legislators structure their speech in such a way to be able to speak more effectively.
Yeah.
At the educational level of their
Yeah, I mean, so at the end of this, I'm going to be pretty confident that the way that rebels talk is intended to target very specific constituencies, that they're talking to particular people when they're about to rebel, and that's the people who are paying attention to their rebellion, but who are not fellow MPs. Go.
So when you talk about these rebellion MPs with the different constituencies,
Yep.
Are they more extreme? Okay,
Yeah, so
you're not looking at groups where they're actually like more to the center.
No. This is ideological extremists are the rebels, and they're trying to connect to ideologically extreme constituents within their districts who reward rebellion and who dislike their own party. You want to think about within the context of the United States, the folks who are going to get mad at the rhinos, the Republicans in name only. Like these are the ideological extremists within the Republican Party. If the Republicans aren't doing enough, if they're compromising too much with the Democrats, you've got to work against them. The same sort of thing is happening in this dynamic. All right. So what do we want to know? We want to know, do rebels use different rhetoric when rebelling? Do MPs who rebel frequently use language that's different than MPs who rebel less often? Why might that be going on? So we got two sort of descriptive questions. How might that be going on? What does this look like? And I'll confess, when John and I started this paper, the answer was, I do not know to any of this stuff. I don't know. We hope that there's something going on because we're going to write a paper about it, but we have no idea what the answers to any of these questions look like. We suspect that if they're rebelling, if their speech is different, it's because they're speaking to different audiences for different purposes prior to a rebellion than when they're going to support the government, right? But we don't know that there's even a basic difference in how they talk before rebellions and not. So what might some of these rhetorical differences look like based on some extant literature on the topic? We might suspect, based on some early work by Kane and Fearjohn and Fiorina, that they would be more sort of constituency-oriented, that they would talk about representation and constituents rather than Westminster and policy in their speeches. We might suspect that they use simpler language, right? That they try and take complicated policy terms and simplify it down to a language that a less expert audience might be able to understand. They might use very different sentiments or tones. There might be more vitriol or more opposition to government or angrier when they're rebelling against their own party, right? And they might use different function words. This is actually one of the sort of ones that surprised us a little bit, but there's a robust literature in psychology that suggests when people are about to do something controversial, they change the way that they use small, short function words. They change the pronouns that they use. This tends to be stuff that in text analysis and political science we ignore. We sort of stop worded out of our text analysis. But we're going to show you that it turns out when you're about to rebel, you're going to use first-person language and connect to yourself much more than you will talk about sort of other folks in the chamber more generally and things like that. And you can only capture that by keeping pronouns around, by keeping I and we and our and stuff like that around rather than taking it out of the text analysis, right? It's difficult to know just by reading the speeches, right? Like when we looked at what Bowen said versus Hannock said, it felt like there was some intuitive differences, but if you had to ask me sort of put your finger on what the difference was, like it would have been hard for me to say, like, these are different speeches, but I'm not 100% sure why they're different speeches, right? So what are we going to do? Well, we're just going to let the data tell us if there are any meaningful differences between these two things. We're going to start decomposing speeches as much as we can. So we went out and we've got data on divisions and debates on those divisions, which occur prior to the division itself, from 1992 to 2015, which gives us 4 changes of parliamentary control, 4 or 5 changes of parliamentary control, which is a nice robust set. We get to see what happens under Labor and the Conservative Party, where rebels might come from different parts of the party. They might be very different people. They might be talking about very different issues, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to use Burt Monroe et al.'s fighting words algorithm to identify words that discriminate between zeros and ones, which in our case are rebels and non-rebels and rebels, the ones are the rebels. Fighting words routine is really just a sort of a division routine, right? It's to say sort of what words in this corpus predict ones in a pretty standard logit model pretty well. That's all that we're trying to do here, right? Which words are associated with the ones, which words seem to be associated with the zeros, right? Which ones seem to be associated with neither one. We're going to start out with looking at a small set of debates to try and sort of grab a little bit of intuition about what's going on. And then we're going to look at the entire corpus of debates across the whole range of parliamentary debates. And we're going to figure out whether these discriminatory words that we discover some discriminatory words, are effective predictors of rebellion. I'm not going to tell you why, I'm not going to tell you how, I'm not going to give you any causal language at all. I'm just going to tell you that they predict rebellion quite well, right? And so we'll go through each of these steps a little bit at a time. So this is what the fighting words algorithm looks like. It's all very fancy and very complicated. All that's really going on is we're asking whether certain words occur more commonly in rebel speeches than they do in not rebel speeches. And then we're going to normalize that, which is what this step is here, by how frequently the word gets used generally across all speeches, right? So there's some complicated, nuanced math. I'm happy to walk through this particular slide in Q&A if folks are interested. Read up on the fighting words algorithm. It's a useful tool, but mostly all that's happening is we're counting up the words in the rebel speeches, counting up the words in the non-rebel speeches, seeing if there's a difference between them, and then dividing by how frequently the word gets used. Right? Because we would expect words that just get said a lot to be used both in rebel speeches and non-rebel speeches an awful lot. So we want to normalize by some interesting things. What we wind up with is a z-score, or how frequently is this word associated with rebellion, given how frequently this word is used, right? Which is a useful thing for us to have, right? So we want to identify divisions where grandstanding is likely to occur to start out with. We want to sort of take our story and put it in the context where we're most likely to find something. If there's anything there, we want to sort of go on the hunt for the most likely scenario to find it in.
So Justin, the
Go.
algorithm goes through every single word.
Every single word.
Every speech.
Yeah, you're going to wind up with a z-score on every word for every division, right? I'll show you what the matrices looks like at the beginning, right? So we're going to look for places where grandstanding is really likely to happen. It turns out for conservatives, every once in a while the Conservative Party will allow a vote in a debate on a second reading of a bill, which is a point at which the bill is not likely to pass, right? So this is not final passage for a particular bill, but it does give ideological extremists the chance to yell about the bill a little bit before it gets defeated, right? The Conservative Party often provides its MPs this very public opportunity to position take on legislation that's doomed to failure, right? Well, this is grandstanding in its purest form, right? You're going to go and do some position taking via speaking and voting, and most of the party is going to kill this legislation, but we want to give you a shot to take a stand on it, right? The Labor Party never really lets this happen, which is unfortunate for us. So what we do to sort of match up with these second readings amongst the Conservative Party is we try and find votes where Jeremy Corbyn and I forget McDonald's first name rebel and the bill fails to pass because Corbyn is an ideological extremist within the Labor Party. If he's voting for something and the bill fails to pass, this is a situation in which ideological extremists in the Labor Party are voting for a bill and are likely to do some position taking, but the bill is doomed to failure also. right? So we've got two scenarios in which ideological extremists are supporting a piece of legislation that's doomed to failure within the party, so they're probably engaged in position taking when they make speeches about these bills. They may not always make speeches, but if they do make speeches, we would suspect that they're going to castigate their party for not supporting this extreme legislation, that they're going to stake out an ideologically extreme position, and if any of our story is right, they're going to be speaking to different people than they would be when they were supporting their own party. Go.
Out of curiosity, do you know why the Conservative Party liked to do this, but Labor didn't?
Would you like an honest answer or a scientific answer? So the honest answer is I just think conservatives are better at this sort of thing than the Labor Party is. They master the collective action problem of allowing our members to have some freedom versus trying to keep everybody together as a coalition more effectively than both the Democrats and the Labor Party does. I don't have a lot of robust evidence to demonstrate to you that that's true, but both in the United States and in the UK, the conservative wing of those parties get more opportunities to sort of grandstand and position take than that happens in the Democrats or in the Labor Party. So we're going to keep words that appear in at least 3 debates. So we're going to look for words within debates that seem to predict differences between the rebels and the not rebels. And we're going to look if they show up in at least 3 debates as being positively associated with rebellion in these very limited, obvious grandstanding opportunities. We're going to hang on to them and see what it looks like. And this is what we get. This is our word cloud, which words are associated with relatively frequent rebellion in these very specific debates where we think grandstanding is going to happen. Right? And so what we see in the Tory rebel words, right? We get I, we get we, protect, provisions, individuals. We see me down here. We see our and us over here. In the Labor Party, we still see I and he and we. We see conduct. We see honorable. That's a reference to somebody else, the honorable member from such and such a place. These are function words. These are not sort of substantive words that have a connotation or anything like that. They don't have a denotation in this sort of setup. These are just words that you're talking to other people with in a normal way. And in most text analysis routines would get kicked out as stop words. They would be language that we wouldn't allow to stick around in the routine that was trying to identify ideology. But our little short look into this suggests that grandstanders, those rebels that are promoting bills that the party knows are going to fail, right? These are the words that differentiate them from the other people that talk about these same bills, right? It's a little bit of a surprise to me is we didn't quite know what to make of things at this point. We're still a little uncertain. How could the use of I and we and our differentiate rebels from not rebels? I didn't understand it at the time. I still don't know that I understand it, but I'm doing my best, right? Well, this is a limited number of debates, and this is just a word cloud. There's not a lot of sort of statistical robustness floating around in here, so we want to put a little more structure on this thing and look at a little bit broader perspective to see if any of the patterns that appear here, the use of pronouns, the use of simple language, that sort of stuff, is that just unique to these particular bills where we're on the hunt for grandstanding in particular, or is this a more general pattern? Go.
There's just a lot more labor speeches.
It's a lot easier to differentiate the labor speeches. Oh, why are there more labor speeches? Because when we go back, right, the second readings are very specific. Like there's only 9 of these second readings that occur. We don't have those second readings for the labor, so we sort of infer what those are. This is anytime Corbyn rebels. So this is just more opportunities for it. So that's why we get more, despite the fact that it's the same 5-year period, right? So we're going to look at the full corpus of debates from 1992 to 2015, right? We're going to use the Fighting Words algorithm on every debate, on every division, right? We're going to wind up with a word by division matrix. So on the column or the rows, we've got every word that ever gets said in any speech. On the column, we have every division that occurs. And IJ cell represents how well that word predicts rebellion on that division. Right? We're going to replace all the negative scores with zeros because you can have some words that predict loyalty rather than predict rebellion. Since we're not interested in that, we just turn all these negative scores into zeros. We're going to do this for everything. And then we're going to sort of, with this giant word by division matrix, we're going to try and cluster words together that seem to commonly predict rebellion. Right? We could just sort of take the mean and then cut it off at the mean or the median or something like that, but that often feels really arbitrary. I'm going to walk you through what k-means does in a minute. It sort of automates the process of differentiating the words that predict rebellion well from the words that don't. We're going to extract the cluster that does the best job of predicting rebellion, And then we're going to examine the common words across the highest clusters across all 5 parliaments. It sounds like a lot. I'm going to walk you through it in a minute. Right? So this is what a word by division matrix looks like. Right? So we've got words on the rows, and we've got each division on the columns. Each cell in the matrix is a number that goes between 0 and about 2.5, since it's standardized by standard deviations. 2.5 covers most of the standard deviations. And that number represents how well that particular word identifies the rebels on that particular division. Right? So me on division 1 gets a 0. That means that that word's not associated with rebellion on that division. Right? 0.75 suggests that that I is associated with rebellion on that division. We do this for literally thousands of words across thousands of divisions. Right? Now again, we could just sort of say, well, we're going to say that the rebel words are the ones that get positive scores, or that are over some benchmark, or that are greater than the mean plus a standard deviation, or something like that. That's going to feel super arbitrary, and that's going to be based on our choice. So what the k-means routine does is it says, all right, which of these words tends to move together? Right? Which words tend to be a kind of dictionary that help us predict rebellion effectively? Right? So it's going to decompose this matrix much like factor analysis does, but instead of giving us a sort of latent factor score, it's going to give us a latent clustering. This bag of words tends to predict rebellion. This bag of words tends to not predict rebellion. And it doesn't require us to set the threshold anywhere. We can allow the data to tell us what the hell's going on. So we do this for one division, or for one parliament, and then we do it for the next parliament, and then we do it for the next parliament, and then we do it for the next parliament, and we do it for the 5th parliament. And so we have what we might think of as a rebel word dictionary for each parliament, and then we ask ourselves which words are common across all 5 parliaments. Which words tend to be in the rebel dictionary for all 5, right? Which ones are common? And since these are both conservative and labor parliaments in control of government, we get to see which words are common across parties, which words are common across time that consistently seem to predict rebellion. What do we get? This is what we get. These are the words that consistently predict rebellion in Britain during divisions, right? And so the 2 strongest predictors of rebellion are I and me. Right? Like the use of I and me predict rebellion across all 5 of these parliaments more effectively than any other words that we find. Honestly, by orders of magnitude. These are all wound up in the routine, but it turns out I and me scores are astronomically higher than everybody else's. What else do we see? Well, we see, simple language like at and a and it, as. We see my and use out here on the other side. We see Mr. and honorable are in here. We see lots of first-person language like I and me and our and us and we are all in here. Mostly what John and I saw when we looked at this was the use of first-person language and the use of pretty simple language. Like these are short words. These are first-person sort of words. And so one of the things that we did was we looked at the words, the syllable length of words that predict rebellion and the syllable length of words that predict non-rebellion. And it turns out the syllable length of rebel words is about 1 syllable shorter, statistically significantly shorter, than the words that we use to predict non-rebellion. Right? So we think we've identified a couple of patterns. Right? We're not confident that those patterns are real, but we think we've seen some patterns here that first-person language, short, simple language, that these are predictors of rebellion. And if you sort of think about it in a fuzzy kind of way, if I was trying to speak to constituents about why I was rebelling, I would probably talk about myself an awful lot, and I would probably use pretty simple language to try and connect with them. It wouldn't be a lot of point in talking about the party if I'm rebelling against the party, and making this debate super complicated isn't going to help me position take with my constituents. We think maybe this makes a little bit of sense, right? This would seem to fall into line with the idea that I'm going to use this debate as a way to connect to my constituents and explain why I'm about to rebel against my own party. But seeing it, just sort of eyeballing it doesn't do us a lot of good. So let's drop it in a model, right? Because that's what we do. We model things statistically, right? So showing that they're a part of the cluster of rebel words is not the same thing as showing that that cluster is very useful to us, that it's a significant predictor of rebellion. So these results come from a pretty simple model predicting whether or not somebody rebels on a vote as a function of the frequency of their first-person language use during debate, the type-to-token ratio, which is a measure of speech complexity. How many different words do I use per total number of words do I use? Am I sort of being repetitive, right? The mean number of syllables in my speech, right? How long and complicated are the words in the speech that I'm going to use? and the length of my speech generally. How many tokens do I have in this thing? And it turns out first-person language is a strong, significant, positive predictor of rebellion. Low language, or low syllable language, I'm going to use simple words. The more syllables you have, the less likely you are to predict. The more complicated your language is, the higher diversity of words that you use, which we measure with type to token ratio, is negatively associated with rebellion, right? So we don't just have a relationship here, we have a significant, meaningful relationship here, right? It turns out the speeches of rebels are different than the speeches of non-rebels, which is great. This is a nice answer to the descriptive questions that we started out with. Do rebel speeches look different than non-rebel speeches? Yes, it turns out they do. Right? Which is great. One of the things that I like to do, however, is to get outside this sort of simple hypothesis testing tradition. So that coefficient is 0.18 on first-person language. Does anybody have any idea what that might mean in context? Right? How useful is that? Is that a big relationship or a small relationship? It's definitely different than 0, but I have no idea whether it's really all that predictive or not.
What's the scale of your
So the scale of first person is 0 to 1, type to token is 0 to 1, and mean syllables goes from like 0 to 20 or something like that. Go.
Do you also run these with like just the words themselves rather
Yeah.
than descriptive characteristics, or are those the same words that come out from that?
Yeah, so if you do it this way and you just use sort of how often does I show up, yes, we wind up with roughly the same thing. And if you pull those coefficients, the numbers meet out relatively well, which is nice. So we're going to use a random forest approach to ask ourselves, not just is this statistically significant, but how powerful a predictor is it really, right? How good do we do predicting rebellion using these variables? Can I, like I asked at the start, predict that a rebellion is about to happen just looking at your language with some reasonable degree of accuracy, right? A random forest approach is an aggregation of regression trees. Regression tree is just a classifier. I'll show you what one looks like in just a minute. The data that we use, we divide them into a training and a test set. So we randomly select some bundle of divisions and debates that we're going to train a model on, and then we're going to test it in some other random subsection of debates so that we get an out-of-sample prediction rather than an in-sample prediction. All of the variables from our logit model are included. We've got random effects for parliament, for individual member. We've got all of the language covariates tossed in there. And we're going to make our life even more difficult. We're going to include covariates for just the number of times you rebel in your career as an MP and the number of rebellions that there are in total on this division. Right? So is this a division that's just likely to encourage lots of rebellion? Are you the type of person that rebels a lot? We're going to ask if, given that we know those things about you, can we still do a better job predicting your rebellion or not? Right? In this particular circumstance, knowing that Peter Bowen rebels a lot, does learning something about his language help me do even better than I would know just knowing that he's a genuinely common rebel within his own party. Right? The algorithm in this bootstrapping process randomly chooses a set of covariates, randomly chooses a set of observations, and tries to classify rebels based on the differences on their covariates. The forest is actually much better than using individual regression trees. It helps us avoid overfitting and lots of other problems. And this is what a regression tree looks like. Right? So this is one tree from our random forest. Right? So what this algorithm or what this forest is doing is saying we can split rebels from non-rebels based on whether we're in the 1997 Parliament or not. Right? Rebels tended to be in the 1997 Parliament in this little subsample of the data. And then if they use first-person language greater than 0.04, they tended to rebel more often, right? That number doesn't have a lot of context. Don't worry about it. It's just first person is the first thing to pop up on this side of the tree. And type to token ratio and first person pop up a lot. Number of rebels finally shows up down here. Somewhat surprisingly, in most of the trees that we looked at, the language stuff helped to divide rebels from non-rebels before things like MPs, frequency of rebellion, or the number of rebels on a division. That was a real surprise to me. I thought sort of your general rebelliousness would have to be the most effective predictor of whether you're a rebel or not. Turns out your language is a better predictor than the frequency with which you rebel, which surprised the hell out of me. All right? So let's look at how good we do. Right? So we're going to look at things like precision and recall and accuracy, which are nice ways of talking about how good a job we do at predicting rebellion. Mostly what you want to care about is this accuracy number, which is the percent that we correctly classify. How frequently do we get your vote right, rebel or not rebel, just using your language covariates, right? Precision and recall are modifications of this particular quantity. On the right, We've got how well does our model do via the inclusion of language versus when we take language out, right? What's the improvement of accuracy, including the language covariates versus a regression forest without the language covariates? On the right, we've got how well do we do with our random forest when we include your mean rebellion rate versus when we take your mean rebellion rate out, so that you get a baseline about how much these improvements in accuracy really look like. All right? So including your MP rebellion rate in your random forest, we're about 2.5 points better in accuracy in predicting your rebellion. Which, in case you're wondering, is a relatively big improvement when we can predict your vote with about 90% accuracy just based on your party. Right? So we jump from 90% to about 92.5% just knowing your frequency of rebellion. When we know your language, we actually do closer to 4% most of the time. So we jump from about 90% to 94%, including the language covariates. So we get a bigger improvement, including language covariates in this random forest, than we get knowing how frequently you rebel on parties, right? Which is a surprise to me. I thought that the prediction language would be useful. I thought it would be a meaningful predictor. I didn't think there was any way it would do better than just knowing whether you were a rebellious sort of person, right? Or whether this was a debate that encouraged rebellion, right? I was convinced that, like, you know, when we talked about the EU, that was going to be the most effective predictor of rebellion. Or when we talked about Jeremy Corbyn, that was going to be the most effective predictor of rebellion. But it turns out those identifiers are not as effective as figuring out whether you use first-person language a lot in your speech to connect to constituents. It's a real surprise to me. All right? So what do we take away from all this fancy jargon? Well, it turns out we can effectively identify and discriminate rebels from non-rebels using how they talk. Right? We can succeed in taking your speech, taking away your name and your party and all that sort of stuff, and correctly classifying whether you're about to be a rebel or not. And we do a lot better than if we were just randomly guessing, right? Actually do better just knowing the content of your debate than we would if we knew your name, right? The use of some of these words is associated with rebellion more broadly and are super predictive within this random forest algorithm, right? They're not just useful for telling us who's a rebel and who's not a rebel, but they're useful in predicting specifically when you're about to rebel. All right, within an individual. It turns out, much again to our surprise, and probably at odds with the way that text analysis occurs a lot in social science, there's a huge importance within this particular paper placed on function words and pronouns and things like that. These are things that we really discard because a lot of text analysis is concerned with mapping ideology, right? And ideology is very much about policy and substance and things like that. But it turns out presenting an image of a maverick or a rebel or somebody who's opposed to the party is very much about an identity rather than about an ideology. And identity seems to be more strongly connected to the function words and pronouns than ideology would be. Let's learn something about that, all right? And it helps us understand how MPs might use their rhetoric and legislative speeches to connect with constituents. This again, we haven't given you the why, we haven't given you the how, but the patterns that we sketch out here suggest that when MPs are about to rebel, they simplify their language and they talk about themselves a lot rather than using complicated language and talking about their party a lot. Given John and I's other work on the topic, that would suggest to us that these speeches are about defending to their constituents why they're about to oppose their own party. It's a constituency connection sort of thing. Constituents may not pay all that much attention to speeches that happen on the floor of Parliament, but if they are paying attention and they're wondering why you're about to rebel, you want to make sure that you make a strong point of why that's going to happen. It's really easy if you were a rebel of the Conservative Party for people to paint you as somebody who's working with the Labour Party. Your speech is your opportunity to point out, no, I'm not on the other team's side, I just don't like what my party's doing. And the only chance you get to do that is a speech on the floor of Parliament. And that is all I've got for you. I'm happy to take questions, thoughts, concerns, musings, nightmares, feelings, whatever.
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah.
The floor is open.
Go.
So this is so cool. I really enjoyed hearing all about it. So I guess to pick up on your last point a little bit, just to kind of push you a little bit more on the mechanism, which I know is kind of not the main focus here.
Well, one day we hope it to be the main focus.
Forward. So kind of picking up on your last point about how, you know, are voters actually paying attention to these floor speeches, right? Like, are they watching the British version of C-SPAN?
Sure.
I guess I don't know the literature from psychology. If you had like a bullet point on it so much. I mean, could it be something in there where it's like, you know, you kind of like feel a certain way when you're about to like oppose your party, and so maybe that's why you're kind of talking differently? Because when I think about grandstanding and connecting to voters, like I would have assumed that these MPs are kind of like talking more about their positions outside, right? Like Donald Trump, like doing a rally versus, you know, what's going on in these speeches. So I guess just, you know, hear about that.
Yeah, so I mean, on your first point, I do think, at least in the sort of interactions with a couple of MPs that we've talked to about this, there is a kind of defensiveness that MPs feel when they're about to rebel. Like they really do feel compelled to go to the mat and like explain to somebody, whoever is listening, why this is about to happen, because rebellion is such a big deal within the party in Britain. They need some opportunity to explain why they're bucking the party tide. We would think that they would do lots of sort of community engagement on these dimensions and have lots of rallies and things like that. But there is some evidence that constituents really care about your speech on the floor of the of Parliament. The frequency, so every day there's a period of time where MPs can give debates or can give speeches that are unrelated to divisions that are about to happen. These are almost always constituency-oriented discussions. Constituents may not be paying attention to these debates very much, but MPs believe that they are, right? And that belief is probably sufficient to make all this action sort of happen. I don't know that anybody's paying attention to British C-SPAN, but on the off chance that they are paying attention to British C-SPAN, MPs want to make sure that constituents know why they're doing what they're doing. Most of that is sort of feelings, right? Like this would map onto that pretty well. We don't have systematic evidence. We do have a conjoint experiment in the field right now where we take British citizens and we ask them, how do you feel about this person rebelling against their party versus how do you feel about this person working with the other party, which are of course observationally equivalent to one another. When you rebel against your own party, you work with the other party. And constituents feel fundamentally differently about these things, right? Rebelling against your own party is a good thing. Working with the other party is a terrible thing. When you point out to people that these are the same thing, nobody knows how to feel about it anymore. They get very confused, right? And so
double negative.
Yeah, this is very difficult to folks. I don't know what's going on anymore. And so that would suggest to us that the way that you frame this rebellion when you talk about it is really meaningful in how people interpret it, right? Because if you present it as maverickiness or independence, people love it. If you present it as working with the other team, people hate it. It turns out when you're a Labour Party member and you rebel against the Labour Party, you are by definition working with the other team. Like that's how it goes. So preliminary evidence suggests that that's much of what's going on. We're trying to mirror that experiment in Britain and in the U.S. and in Germany, but we haven't sort of rounded out the other samples yet. Richard?
Just a quick question to sort of distinguish between sort of the mechanism. Is it psychological? Is it perhaps strategic?
Yeah.
You know, not knowing a whole lot about the context, but what's sort of the motivation behind a legislator trying to get a personal vote in a system which is mostly about programmatic parties? If it comes at, you know, the cost of being able to shape policy or the cost of promotion in the chamber, you know, why would this be a motivation?
So at the beginning of this paper, I would have told you I have no idea, right? Like, why would British MPs pursue a personal vote? Having done a little bit more homework on this topic, comparative politics scholars would actually tell you that Westminster is a better opportunity for personal vote than lots and lots of other systems. It's not as open to developing a personal vote as the U.S. is, for example, but there's a better chance to develop a personal vote in Britain than in Germany or Austria or lots of other places that have different list-style systems or have much more party control than happens in Britain. Britain does have single-member district elections. MPs do care about whether their constituents like them or not. The party is not quite the be-all and end-all in Britain that we would suspect it is here. It is less open to a personal vote than the U.S. is, but there is an emerging literature in British politics that suggests that dyadic representation in Britain is a real thing. It really does exist. It's not all about parties all the time. I was a blind American politics scholar. I didn't think that was what was going on, but it turns out when you go on the ground and you talk to MPs, they care about what their constituents think. They will occasionally buck the tide. So Bowen is really famous for saying that he was in Westminster to represent his constituents. His job was not to represent Westminster to his constituents. That he really did want to be his constituents' voice in Westminster rather than the other way around. Kelsey.
I agree that this probably is like a strategic aim to actually like connect more with their constituents and stuff like that. There's to me the like implication that you might be able to get some leverage on would be that if that's the case, then they're trying to publicize it in some way,
Yeah.
or that they think it's more likely to get picked up by newspapers and stuff.
Yeah.
So either
We've done none of this. This would be a wonderful idea, right? Like, let's go out and get some press releases about it. John and I talked for a little while about tracking down like Facebook and Twitter accounts for MPs. They don't have those nearly as much as our members do. In point of fact, the parties in Britain really crack down on their members who use social media too much, because then they get outside of the party leadership's control. And so there's just a little bit less independence and ability to sort of craft that message. But it would be nice if we could go get local newspapers or local press releases to try and see if people are bragging about this rebellion differently than they would be otherwise.
something like downloading news stories off of LexisNexis and just seeing if
It would be a lot of fun.
races actually.
It would be a lot of fun. We haven't done that yet. It would be a nice follow-up, though. I agree entirely. Carol, and Dan. No, I mean, you just laid like this, like we gotta.
So many questions. Okay, so.
Most of them are going to be, I don't know.
So you have seen the questions emerge. But, okay. So I'll start with just a few words. Who?
Mm-hmm.
When?
Mm-hmm.
Strategy?
Yeah.
Poole and Rosenthal. And I'll start with Poole and Rosenthal. Poole and Rosenthal cannot, the Poole-Rosenthal LC scores cannot be calculated for the UK.
Yep.
And there's a beautiful piece that demonstrates this anyway, and this is the consensus. Because the parties in legislative voting are so
Lockstep.
unified,
Yeah.
right? So it's not at all surprising to me that you said at the end, party predicts 90%. It's actually cool that the language covariates boost the prediction 4%. The typical expectation would be virtually nothing.
Yeah, you get a ceiling effect.
On the other hand, it's completely understandable to me. I and me are the two strongest predictors within this bin of language covariates. But then there are things like, I want to know more about not the sound of rebellion. Okay, but thank you so much for getting us to think about the sound of rebellion. I want to think about the strategy of rebellion. Who and when? Who? Things like what's the vote margin of the MP at the last election? Who, now you say that extremists rebel most often when they're in the government. Really interesting. Does thinking about who in terms of the government variations in the size of the governing majority, and of course the variations can happen even during a parliamentary term, given deaths, losses at the by-elections to replace people who die, et cetera, elevation to the lords, et cetera. And then I want to know about when, in terms of a couple of different things having to do with legislative process, government bill, private member bill, final vote, non-final vote. Is the party whip imposed or not? When is a 3-line whip, which has, as Jonathan knows quite well, has a very specific meaning? When is this imposed? Yeah. And so, I think and all of this should mean so much for the strategy of rebellion. If you're still having, once you take into account these alternative sorts of explanations, if you're still having some weight for the language covariates, it's absolutely astonishing. Yeah. And it is contrary to anything that people know. Yeah. And also, so especially you want to, and people assume about the operations of parliamentary government. If, for example, the size of the governing majority means nothing or close to it, this is astonishing. Yeah. I mean, So the grandstanders attaching themselves to their I and me are willing to vote out
Yeah.
of government.
Yeah.
Bring on an early election, given parliamentary design. That's astonishing. That goes contrary to the quintessential and earliest parliamentary system.
Yeah.
How could that be?
I don't know.
So this is
No.
this is really, really cool. This is your next book.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things about that. So these effects exist if we include division random effects in there, right, which are controlling for anything that might be unique to this particular division, right? So whether it's a final passage vote versus a second reading vote versus the whip was active on this particular vote, we still get some stuff floating around in there. That effect does get weaker, right, because when you're already starting out at 90% predictive accuracy, every covariate that you add gets you closer to the ceiling, so you can only get so much better. You can't get over 100% accuracy, so you're just squashing out variance every time you add something in. But the language effect is still there, and the first-person language effect is the most consistent effect in here, right? It beats type-to-token ratio and mean syllables. Those effects go away when we start tossing in things like division random effects or differences across the divisions. But the first-person language thing sticks around, right? Like that's a really robust effect that if you use first-person pronouns, I'm going to improve whether I'm about to predict you're a rebel or not really, really well. And better than most of those other things will, which just, neither John nor I thought that was what was going to happen coming in. We thought maybe like language, like when you talk about European Union or when you talk about immigrants or Muslims or issues, were going to be what told us about rebels. And that's not the stuff that tells you about rebels, somewhat surprisingly. I would have to guess that governing party size matters. We haven't checked, right? Like I can't imagine. Most of this is coordinated, right? You can tell by that second reading stuff that the party does want to create situations in which its grandstanders can grandstand sometimes because it's electorally beneficial to the party. It's a helpful thing for the party to allow members to improve their own margins sometimes if it's not going to hurt the party's ability to govern. Right, so I'm guessing that this is coordinated behavior, that the party's allowing it to happen sometimes, and the degree to which you can allow it to happen has got to be related to the size of your margin, right? Like I can't let the rebels be rebels if I need them, right, to actually pass legislation. But we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. I mean, I think that's right. And I mean, we want to spend time thinking about within Britain and then sort of extending this grandstanding story to other institutional contexts, right? Because if this is really about developing a personal vote, what I talked about before, when you move to a system where personal votes are weaker, this stuff should all go away. We shouldn't be able to connect rebellion to different types of speeches. You shouldn't observe rebellion in the first place in those kinds of places. And so we're hoping that lots of these institutional features, like the types of divisions or when we're whipping or the size of the majority or the institutions that encourage personal votes are going to flip this stuff around.
Right. Quick double dip though, but you have some cool ways of building bridges between, say, Britain and Germany, because you have the hybrid voting laws mixed in Germany, so you would expect if there's anything like a personal vote going on in Germany, it should happen in the single-member districts.
Yeah.
People, the MDBs, elected from those, right?
And a few of the German states actually have single-member districts too.
Yes. And then you have the 2010-2015 coalition in Britain, so that kind of sets up a potential bridging comparison for the coalitions in Germany.
I like it. I like it. Yeah, no, I like it. I think that's a good. We hadn't sort of put that particular sort of contextual bridge together. We were just thinking of Germany as a place where there would be less of a personal vote, but there's actually some comparables across those places that would actually make it very. Yeah, I like it. Thank you. That's useful. I think you were up there.
Yeah, two things. So, this is
two things is a chance for a cookie.
Creative and well thought out project. I really like it. More to the point, how do you know who the audience is here?
Yeah.
Right? So it seems like this. The assumption, sort of at the end of this, is that these are rebels speaking to their constituents. constituents. But we don't know that that's the case. It could be that they're speaking to party members, that this is a potentially costly signal that they're sending to party leaders.
Yep.
Could be that this is a signal that they're sending to other members of the rank and file within their own party, suggesting that they might consider rebelling against party leaders. So, I think it would be helpful, not necessarily in this project, but going forward, to think about audience. And if you arrive at the point where you're pretty convinced that this is a conversation between the MP and his or her constituency, then I think there's some really neat things that you can do going forward, right? This seems to me like it's begging for survey experiments.
Yeah.
It's really straightforward. You have very crisp expectations about how constituents should respond to different forms of speech, using different types of language. So you can really, I think, pretty straightforwardly test your arguments if once you've committed to the point that this is projecting to the constituents. And you might even get some interesting differences across constituencies, which is part of why I was asking the earlier question, right? It might be that rebels constituents respond more positively to this straightforward, simple language phrased in terms of I's and me's and less syllables, but other constituencies might not.
No, I like that.
And in a sense, that would be the strongest evidence for your argument.
Yeah, so I don't want to sort of oversell here. What we want to say is that you can predict rebellion with speech, right? Like that's an effective predictor of speech, and that those predictions are what you would expect if people are speaking to constituents. They are also what you might expect under other models, and so we can't say like this is a critical test, our story is the right story. It does reflect the pattern that would be there if our story were true about grandstanding and connecting and stuff like that, but it could be easily lots of other audiences that would like to see simpler speech focused on individuals and things like that. So we got some more work to do. I did garner a great deal of money for surveys for a reason. So yeah, I mean that's the plan, is to think about, when we started this, what I thought we were going to see was ideological extremists focus on a particular set of issues that moderates don't focus on, and so that's what they were going to couch issues where they were rebelling in terms of national security or socialism or these sort of outside wing ideas, as opposed to sort of moderate policy debates. And we just didn't see any of that, right? Like, just the more we hunted, the less policy we saw being reflected across lots and lots of divisions, and the more of this functional language differentiating people surprised us. That surprise means I don't have a real good handle on why it's happening yet. Like, I know the pattern's there, I'm confident the pattern is strong, and now we're on to sort of figuring out, what do these mechanisms really mean? What do they look like? What's the causal pathway that's underlying all this stuff? And it could be a heterogeneous set of causal pathways. Who knows? And from the institutional perspective, like, I get really amped about thinking about what this means for agenda setting. Like, what issues am I going to bring up as the party leader that's going to allow my people to connect to their constituents sometimes, but be on the party's team other times? How do I balance this need amongst my extremists to be mavericky versus to not to toe the party line sometimes? I see lots of little avenues for sort of moving things along the way, because like there's, if this is about connecting to constituents, there's also this question about how much do I want to let my people connect to their constituents, right? Like, is that a thing that as a party leader I'm willing to tolerate a lot of? Yeah, maybe not. Do I punish rebellion by extremists differently than I punish rebellion by moderates now, because I know the rebellion from extremists has a reason that's not about our policies, it's about something else, right? There's lots of little things that come along the way that I feel like connect some of this stuff in ways that we don't understand very well just yet. Question? Any question?
Yeah, this was speaking to like possibly future survey experiments. Would you consider like using conjoint experiments for this type of thing, where you would give people, forced choice, 2 paragraphs, one with the first person language and one issue based, or would you go with like more standard type one type?
No, I mean, I love conjoints because I like to mix a bunch of stuff together all at once. I think most of what we do is conditional on something else. And conjoints give us lots of power on that dimension. We haven't planned our next series of experiments. I really liked the sort of rebel versus bipartisan conjoint that we started with as the first thing that we've done. I really like doing stuff that makes the rank and file look a little silly. And this is one of those nice experiments where like you can couch the same thing slightly different ways and get profoundly different results. I like the idea of sort of trying to just sub out I and we and our with the party and stuff like that and seeing if we get different. My mind had been on sort of, if I manipulate the sophistication of the policy debates, do I change how people feel about it? But I like the idea of switching the pronouns around and things like that and seeing if we get some differences. I would guess that we will, right? I mean, in the little bit of anecdotal data that I've got, like, party supporters always talk about the team. They talk about the party and what we're trying to accomplish for the country and all that sort of stuff. And rebels are always about, like, the party's doing terrible stuff and I'm going to save us and we're going to do this. And it's all about us as opposed to some third-person thing floating around out there that you're trying to pass credit for success to. So most of this starts from a really simple idea that ideological extremists are interested in position taking and moderates are interested in credit claiming. Okay? That moderates want to take credit themselves and pass credit on to the party for success, and ideological extremists aren't interested in any of that credit. They just want to stake out a pure position that their ideologically extreme constituents can get on board with.
Thinking in the context of a majoritarian party system, like if we look at like populist parties, especially the populist radical right in Europe, if they make an elite or another a boogeyman, like it's pretty easy to point to like the European Union or the United Nations or other parties, right? Because there are literally other parties they can point out. But it would make sense, I think, in a majoritarian system when there's no other easy party boogeyman to start using this I and stuff language because you don't have another party to point to.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. If we move to a place where we had like a third or a fourth party, would we see any of this stuff? Because there's an obvious opponent. Whereas, you know, if you rebel against your party in a two-party system and you talk about, you know, I'm working with the other guys, that's a problem for you. You don't have anybody to blame. You either talk badly about your own party or you talk about yourself. You can't talk about the other team in a meaningful way. No, I like that. That's a good idea. I hadn't thought about that before. Thank you. Kelsey. And in the back. I saw you. Don't worry.
Have you guys also thought about, sorry, not trying to
No.
think of how to rephrase it. Has two questions. One, have you already like run this on House debates in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Did the same things come out?
It's a less we and a more I, right? It's not just like first person, but it's like first person singular as opposed to just first person. Like there's no we, there's no team. It's Ted Cruz that's talking about himself.
The other
I can talk about Ted Cruz. I'm from Texas.
it sounded like in how you guys extracted the words from the Fight Words algorithm was to actually then essentially see which words correlated across the different.
Yeah.
I don't know what they're called in the UK, but Congresses.
They're called parliaments.
Sorry.
That's all right. It took me a long time to figure out when I was supposed to capitalize parliament when it wasn't, but I got a hold of it.
I think possibly by correlating across those, you might be actually like dropping out the boogeyman for each one, and like some potentially some more like issue specific, or at least like this person is terrible and I'm going to rail against this like.
Yeah. So
background.
the K-means thing requires words to sort of move into rebellion and not together, right? And so it's creating like a team of words. They're not quite an n-gram in that they have to appear side by side, but they have to appear in rebellion together frequently to make it into our cluster. After we did it and we wrote the paper, that started to feel a little funny, right? Because that could mean that sometimes a word is really predictive of rebellion all by itself, but no other words are predictive of rebellion in that circumstance, and that word's getting tossed out, right? Because it's not a part of the common words that predict rebellion. I wasn't 100% sure what to do about it, because again, I didn't want to just fall back on like, I'm going to take words that are above the mean or greater than 0 or some other sort of arbitrary threshold. I wanted some inductive way for somebody to pull these words out for me. I didn't really like factor analysis as an approach because it wasn't going to give me like a bucket again. Eventually I was going to have to make some cutoff myself. And so K-means was the best we could come up with. But I've been rattling my brain around trying to figure out like what's another way to make sure that these like individual outlier words might make it into our bucket too.
And I was just thinking something more like a lasso or ENET, where it and do that for each, essentially predict the votes, and then do that for each individual parliament.
Yeah.
That is the word.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like that. We're running up on the edge of all of my machine learning skills at this point, so I tried to throw everything I could at you, but now I get to write the word out lasso, and I'm pretty excited about that. As I hand up over here.
So, if I've understood this correctly, you're looking at rebellion just within the governing party?
Yeah, it's just in the governing party, because rebellion in the opposition party is just so rare, and rebels in the opposition party almost never give a speech about their rebellion. So like even if we had the ones for the rebels in the opposition party, there's no words that precede it in a meaningful way.
Okay, because my impression was that it was actually still like fairly common, especially now, right? So like both parties extremely divided. There's still quite a few examples from the last year.
Yeah, that's a super recent phenomenon, right? Like if we go back to 1992 to 2010, which is where the bulk of our data exists, the opposition parties were just super rare in terms of rebellion. It just didn't happen. That's one of the things that really surprised us, right? Like when he's in the governing party, Corbyn rebels all the time. When he's in the opposition party and nobody's talking about him anymore, he's loyal on 99% of the votes. Like he never rebels. And the moderates don't need to get bought off in the opposition party in the British system. In the US system, we need supermajorities for a variety of reasons, but in a parliamentary system, you don't have to worry about buying off the moderates and the other parties, right? So moderates don't rebel, the extremists are super loyal, we just don't have enough variance. I mean, even if there are some rebellions, we don't have enough speech that goes with it to relate these things to one another very well, so.
Okay, bearing that in mind,
Mm-hmm.
still, like as you say in the paper, like with Corbyn and McDonald's that you're analysing, it's very unlikely for these rebellion or backbencher rebels to actually come to like the front line of the party. But now we've got this unique circumstance where McDonnell and Corbyn are the leaders of the Labour Party, and I know they're in the opposition, but still, I think perhaps I'm wondering if you think there's potential to analyse now that they're actually leading the party, to analyse the kind of language.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess with a sufficient amount of time where leadership is out on the wings rather than in what we would think of as a sort of more moderate end of the party, that we'll see some very different things in how this pattern works. Whether the opposition, so I don't know enough about British politics to know whether the opposition under ideologically extreme leadership will suddenly experience a big spike in rebellions. That I couldn't tell you. If there are, and they allow some speeches to happen, we will be on top of it. But I mean, to do the things that we do, right? Like we need a reasonable quantity of rebellion, and we need those rebels to talk a lot, right? Like we need folks to speak about their rebellion pretty frequently. So just having lots of rebels isn't enough, right? I need people to talk about it fairly often. And so whether Corbyn will allow more talking from the rebels than historic leaders have allowed from the rebels is unclear to me. I don't know, is the long-winded answer to a well-spoken question. Sorry.
It's a very half-baked idea.
Sweet.
I mean, you can also think you have conservatives, and this kind of goes back to what Olivia was saying about more than two parties or something. You have varying strength of like the Lib Dems over this time period. So at the beginning, they're relatively small. They grow, they become part of the governing coalition, and then they fall back down.
Sure.
I mean, I guess you talked about random effects of certain parliaments. That
Yeah.
might be, but it might be interesting to think about if there is more kind of uncertainty about who is in charge and who is not in charge. When they're not as big as the Conservatives or Liberals, but they have a sizable, set of MPs over this time period in certain cases. Does it change the way that rebels talk about rebelling?
Yeah. So my quick answer or quick response to that is John has assured me that this doesn't make any sense if we think about more than two parties. Why? I'll email him and ask him. I think the general sense is that like when there are three parties that are potentially powerful, and you're in the governing party coalition, rebelling against your party doesn't pose a same threat as in a two-party system, right? Because in a two-party system, the magic is that if you rebel, you can be presented as being a part of the other team. In a three-party system, when you rebel and you're in the governing party, there are two other options, and one of them might not be all that bad, right? And so we spent a lot of time thinking about this sort of two-party thing. How the Lib Dems fit into this, we've punted every time somebody's asked us about it. And they've asked us about it a lot. I don't want you to think that it's not a reasonable question from all of you. We every time we sort of said, the Lib Dems haven't been big enough to matter, and every reviewer said, okay. and we've moved on. We've moved on with our lives. I don't know that I buy that, but it's worked every time.
Yeah,
So
it's definitely the case probably at the beginning and the end of your kind of your years, but in the center, I mean, they were up to over 60 MPs, but there's still a lot. They're still obviously drowned out by conservatives and Labour.
well, and I mean, I would be curious about what it would mean for for somebody in the Lib Dems to rebel from their own party, right, and work with somebody else, right? Like what happens when these sort of center parties start experiencing rebellion? Can they present themselves as mavericky when you're in the middle of this sort of thing? I don't know. So I don't want you to think that I don't find all this stuff interesting. It's just we haven't got far. Like we started out really guessing at a lot of this stuff. I have a handle on some of it, but not a whole lot of it. So, okay.
Threat of an existential exogenous shock.
I love it.
Note that I'm trying to frame this in very general terms because there's a specific threat that I'm thinking
Sweet.
about.
She's gonna ask this really nice general question at the end, be like, "You're an idiot."
Scotland.
That's right.
Referendum 2014, and also this is in a parliament in which the SNP is relatively large, even at the national level, not just in the Scottish Assembly. But so the general sort of thing to keep in mind as you move to a broader cross-national framework is thinking about these potential exogenous shocks and how does, so you don't have a two-party system in Britain. If you calculate the effective number of parties in the parliament, it's more than two, as it always is in the U.S. or in the 20th century. And yet, even you do see variation over time within the time frame that you have. And but it's not just thinking about the effective number of parliamentary parties. I mean, there are these potential exogenous shocks that are really big. It's not just policy shocks. We're talking in the British case of a potential shock to the territorial integrity of the state. And so boy, would it be interesting to include in your German study the last parliament, the last Bundestag of West Germany. And they know that and then there is on the horizon the first unified election. And then there is the immediate there's the first unified election has been held, and here are all these MDBs, the largest number in a democracy, and for Germany, and whoa, I mean, there we have the exogenous shock. Actually, it's occurred. The territory has changed, not just a threatened to change, but it has changed. I don't know, just throwing it out.
No, I mean I like all that. So I mean, like what's really sort of at the heart of our story is why do people rebel from their parties, right? And the sort of the general concern here is that it's getting reflected in several comments is that it's not always about connecting to constituents. Sometimes it's about policy rebellions and working with the other team, and how many other teams do you have to work with, and how can you present a story about this rebellion. I think all of those are reasonable points to make. We started this with a very U.S.-centric sort of story, trying to talk about why the Republican Party seems to have rebels in it surrounding the Tea Party, right? And we've tried to grow this to other places. I would guess that rebels haven't always used rebellion to connect to constituents, right? And so the scope conditions of when that's real and how exogenous shocks to the effective number of parties change how successful you can be in using rebellion to connect to constituents, whether there's a demand for mavericky sort of behavior amongst your parliamentarians is an interesting question. I don't know. In the U.S., the American public has hated parties for a really long time, so presenting yourself as an opponent of parties can be a valuable frame. I can't imagine that that's true everywhere all the time. Like that, it would seem impossible to me that that's consistently true. I like the sort of integration of some sort of regional, territorial shock to the country as a cool tool to think about it some.
All right, well, let's say thanks to Justin.
Thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking some time out.